This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. On this episode, I speak to Sarah Damoff about her debut novel, The Bright Years. Sarah Damoff is a writer, and she's also a social worker. Her novel, The Bright Years, is about a lot of the subjects and themes she encounters in her work, namely addiction, its intractable roots, its long, damaging tentacles. As we enter the story, we meet the Bright family in Texas. There is alternating narration in chapters, and we get the points of view of Ryan and Lillian Bright, their daughter, Georgette. Ryan and Lillian love each other, but Lillian has been harboring a deep secret about the fact that she once had a child, a son, with another man. Ryan has a secret too. He's an alcoholic. It's a secret he's held on to for a long time. It's done a lot of damage, and it threatens to fracture the fabric of their mostly happy family life when it all comes out in the open. Georgette is caught in the middle, and then when Lillian's long-lost son comes in search of his birth mother, Georgette is forced to face the many losses of her past. I spoke to author Sarah Damoff about her novel, The Bright Years. Sarah, can you tell us about this novel?
I can. The Bright Years follows 4 generations of the Bright family. From beginning to end, we span 60 years. We meet Ryan Bright as a child, and then we see him and Lillian fall in love. They get married and start a family, but they both have some things in their past that they haven't been completely honest with each other about, and really haven't been completely honest with themselves. Ryan is struggling with a dependence on alcohol, and Lillian had a child whom she placed for adoption years before that she hasn't shared with Ryan, and so their pasts are haunting them a bit. And as they have a daughter, Georgette, their marriage begins to struggle under the weight of their histories. And we watch Georgette come of age and try to make sense of who her parents are. That's kind of a central question at the core of the novel, is from both sides, parent and child, how we learn parents as people and how generations impact each other. So Georgette comes of age, and eventually Lillian's son, whom she placed for adoption, comes back looking for his birth family, and this is a shock to them. And Georgette has also been hurt by her father Ryan as he's struggled with his addiction, and so she really has to discover some secrets from her parents' past and also experience some of her own losses and life surprises, and then decide how she's going to move forward in her own life in terms of her relationship with her parents and her willingness to open up to forgiveness and love and the things that life presents to her. So the book is told in 3 points of view. They're not alternating. So we start with Lillian, and then we hear from Georgette as she grows up, and then finally the final section of the book is hearing from Ryan himself. So that is the story of the Bright family as we see them through the decades.
And even with such a thorough and detailed summary as you've just given us, readers who have not read the book yet are in for so much more. The writing in this book is so lyrical. It's so gorgeous. Your prose is so gorgeous. There is this beautiful love story, and then there are these dramatic situations, some of which are informed by your experiences as a social worker. What was the moment in your life as a social worker when you thought, this could be a novel? There's just a swirl of experiences that I feel may have come from that work that you've done.
Absolutely. Thanks for asking that. So the characters in this book, they are not based on any one person or any one family, but I have worked with foster families and foster children and their birth families for many years, and have just had the privilege of witnessing up close how families walk through really vulnerable, difficult seasons. And I had actually attempted another manuscript before The Bright Years, and it didn't go very well because I was trying to say too much. I think too many broad things, too much of an agenda to maybe educate about child welfare. So when I sat down to write The Bright Years, I said out loud, my only agenda is to tell a beautiful family story. And from there, it really was just a focus on the characters and all of the experiences that I've had with families in social work were just underneath the surface of everything I wrote as this family went through its own seasons and joys and losses. And thank you for your kind words about the book. I agree, it's a love story. I think every family story has love stories in it. There's parent and child, and there's the relationship between the spouses in this case, and there's even grandparent and grandchild. And something in my experience with social work is that people go through very hard things behind closed doors. And I wanted to be unflinchingly honest about that and kind of give us an intimate inside view of that. At the same time, in my experience, even a family in crisis, there could be a child singing a song in the kitchen and there could be someone laughing in the backyard. I mean, there still is beauty and hope all around the edges of these hardships that families go through. And so that was another thing that was really important to me to take to the page of The Bright Years, was to just kind of show that delicate balance of the human experience that I've been so grateful to get to participate in and witness as a social worker. So just that balance of honesty about the hard things in life, but also that there is always still beauty and reason to hope hiding around the edges of those families and circumstances.
Yeah, I really think that I want to underscore this idea that this is not a novel that reads like a string of your case studies or something like that, or that readers would not be able to identify with one or another character, or with the idea that a family can fall into crisis from one day to the next, or that there's a slow simmer of crisis that then boils over. I think families understand this. I think most of us understand this and see the resonance of that idea. Lillian and Ryan do start off with a beautiful love story, and it seems ideal and perfect. And yet, because we have an inkling about their past, we start to see where that idea, the novelty of it, can wear away. And we also understand the way that life just continues to happen, and the grind of the workday and paying the bills and everything else. I do want to emphasize this idea that this is not about, oh, it's by a social worker and these are case studies and this man has an addiction issue and there we go. Actually, these characters are so completely resonant. The other thing about this that I appreciate too is the idea of the setting. When Lillian first becomes pregnant, it's 1974, and I was thinking about how during that time it was maybe more difficult than it is today. Maybe I can say this, for a young single woman to have a baby, to be pregnant, to have a baby, and the stigma around that in the 70s. The other side of this too is the idea of secrets. And I feel like this is another kind of very resonant element. I heard somebody say once about families, all families have secrets, and if you don't think this is true, the secret is about you. And they said it sort of tongue in cheek, but
Right.
it seemed to me to have a lot of truth to it. But I wonder if you can talk about this idea of setting this, having this be in the 1970s for some of these characters, for the character, for instance, of Ryan's mother, who was also going through some things in another era.
Yes, thank you for asking that. And I appreciate what you're saying about the resonance too. I absolutely wanted it to feel relatable and not sensationalized. I have a distaste for books in particular that might sensationalize trauma. And so that was very important to me, that it could just be something that we can all relate to, what these characters are going through, and to see them as just holistic, fully formed people. And some of that definitely was helped, I think, by the time period that I wrote in, which ended up happening for maybe kind of a boring reason, which is I knew as I started writing, I knew it was going to span a lot of years. And I wanted the book to stop before we got to the pandemic, because that would be a different story. And so I knew it needed to end in 2019 and the ages I needed the characters to be, and kind of worked backwards from there. And I also used a little writing cheat by making Georgette the same birth year and the same age as I was, because though there was still some research to do on all the little details of the time period and what was happening in the world and references, it helped me to be able to think back that way. But certainly for prior to her birth in the book, I had to do research. And I interviewed people. I'm trying to think if they were not necessarily for time period related, but I did interview people, even with my background in social work and the experiences I had had. I specifically wanted to speak with people who had some of these experiences that are in the book, whether it was related to adoption or alcoholism. And just hearing from other people and doing research was really how I said it in the time that I said it in.
That doesn't sound like a boring reason. I think it's
Well,
kind of
yeah.
genius.
Good. I'm glad.
And I want to talk about, so the idea of having it end in 2019, the novel spans decades, but something I did appreciate was the way you integrated other global events,
Mhm.
big historical things that happened, like the Branch Davidians in 1993 and September 11th, 2001. I found that so effective in showing us the ways in which what's occurring around us, we're living through history more
Right.
broadly. And it colors, just like the way the pandemic did, it colors our lives in the moment and also beyond. And it can be something huge and overwhelming and becomes part of our story, but also part of our strife, part of what we're trying to work through as a family or as an individual, the way we react to external situations or situations out there that we're still affected by. So I thought that was so interesting for this, it's a sort of a multi-generational story, and it has those hallmarks too. And I was thinking, this is so true. If you're setting it in the 90s, part of the time, what was going on there that also is affecting these characters? I think that's important. I think it's important to think about that.
Thank you. I'm glad that you picked up on that. And some of my favorite works of art, whether that's film or books, they do that as well. And that's always stood out to me, where it almost has this hint of a memoir type feel because the characters feel so real, because we're able to relate to. Oh, of course, I remember when the towers fell, and now they're living through that as well. The book A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, there's a nod to that book in The Bright Years. And when I read that book, something that really stood out to me was the sense of place. As someone here in Texas, I haven't spent a lot of time in New York, and the way that Brooklyn really came to life, but then it was just, of course, a fictional family. And that was really in the back of my mind as I started writing The Bright Years. And also, as you mentioned, we cover so much time. And as the characters felt more and more real to me, and I was thinking, okay, they went through, always at the forefront, I think, in our lives is what's happening with us personally, but then always in the background is what's happening in the broader society. And so as I'm going through years in the book, and I'm thinking in the back of my mind, oh, this major event was happening in our country or in our world, had to at least reference how that might be or might not be on the radar of these characters of this family as they were living through it. So thank you for saying that.
Oh no, I found it so fascinating the way that it works in this novel. Part of that for me was this feeling I had while reading the book where I would think, there's nobody who's going to read this book who would say that would never happen,
Mm.
or I can't relate to that, or that's far-fetched. The verisimilitude of what occurs, and I don't want to say too, I don't want to spoil it for readers, but there's so many things that happen that do happen
Mm-hmm.
every day in families all the time. And so there's not a single thing, there's not a single situation, big or small, dramatic or not so, that where somebody would say, "Oh, that would never happen." It's so grounded in verisimilitude, and I appreciate that so much. And the ways that I found myself relating to the mothers in the book too, for as different as I am from them, the resonance again was something that was so striking to me, because these are people that really do love each other. There's so
Mm-hmm.
much going on. There's so many secrets. There's so many negative situations. But at the heart of things, they truly love each other. And this is the way it is, I think, sometimes with addiction. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I don't like sort of these offhanded depictions of addicts as not being capable of loving their family or someone else. The idea of addiction that's in this story is another thing that no one could say, "Oh, that would never happen." It's so grounded in verisimilitude. And it's true that things occur that will occur in the course of a life, or just our day-to-day things that we put up with, that we have to see to. But addiction adds a layer of stressors and tensions to these relationships and to these families, to their jobs, to their careers, to their health. So I wonder if you can talk about this idea of addiction as something that affects the people in this family multi-generationally, but also is, as you said, it's not an exploitation of
Mm-hmm.
trauma in this novel. It's something that that many families, that the
Mm-hmm.
family is living with, and that becomes part of the story, that is a part of the story. But it's not the only part of the story.
Absolutely. I so appreciate how you articulated all of that. And I'll say it was an interesting experience when I put out the call to interview people who were willing to speak with me about their own experiences. And it did kind of just feel like people were coming out of the woodworks, and they were so generous and vulnerable with me. But it is stunning how prevalent struggles with alcoholism in particular, but even some of the other losses. And there's no foster system or child welfare system in here, but there is a time when a granddaughter is staying with her grandmother because it's not a season where her parents can take care of her like they want to be able to, and that kind of thing. It's a little less dramatic. It's very common, these things. And even as I've started to get feedback on the book, people are reaching out to me all the time just with this sense of, were you writing about me? Were you writing about my family? How did you know? I mean, just that ability to relate, because some of these things are so prevalent, maybe not talked about as much, and which is why people feel like, how did you know to write this? And so I guess I just like to tell people it's these things are very common. There's one of my favorite writers is Frederick Buechner, and he has a quote. I'm not going to get it exactly right, but it says something very simple like, "The world is terrible and beautiful. Do not be afraid." And just that balance is happening for all of us. And so I think that's why people are reaching out and saying that. And in terms of addiction, it was very interesting for me to write Ryan Bright. I never set out to write an addiction book or to have alcohol be a main theme in the book. This book actually began as a novel in letters. It was epistolary. My first draft was completely letters. And the conceit of it was that Lillian had this past with the child that she placed for adoption, and so she was starting to write letters when she had Georgette, and she was raising Georgette because she knew someday I'm going to want to tell Georgette about who I was before she was born. And originally, part of that was going to be, let me tell you about your father, Ryan. He had this struggle. He's kind of out of the picture. And as I started writing that, it was like the character, Ryan's character, was tapping on my shoulder and saying, you're making me too flat. I have more of a story. Give me a voice. There's more complexity here. And I really realized that, in his particular story in this book, he's very in and out of their lives, but he doesn't distance himself because he doesn't love them. He distances himself because he does, and he sees that he's kind of getting on this spiral similar to his own father, and he doesn't want to do that to them. And that's not to make excuses for his behavior, but as you said, and his section of the book is, I think, the shortest one of all three characters, and there's a lot else that happens. And so I never even intended for alcohol to kind of take this front seat, but that is something that he's going through, and I wanted it to be just it's a long journey for a lot of families. It's a very up and down and a long journey, and so that's what it is in their case. But yes, he wouldn't let me make him a stereotype or a flat character, and there's a lot more to him. I think there's even a line in the book in his section where he's reflecting, and he says, alcohol is a big part of my story, but it's a small part of me just as a person. And so kind of trying to, through what they experience together, explore this reality that, with substance abuse, which is very common, the substance is neutral, and it's more about how the person relates to the substance and why. And so that is explored a little bit, but in the context of the lives that they're living on a day-to-day basis and their relationships with each other.
Wow, this idea that it started off as this novel in letters, this epistolary novel, I'm so fascinated by this because I can imagine that this would be a way that you really got to know Lillian, that you really got to know the characters. But also then I'm so interested to know this idea that Ryan is saying, wait a minute, I'm more than just this. My story runs deeper than that, because we can see this in the bright years when we read this novel and Lillian is telling the story. We're in love with Ryan. we're like, where did this guy come from? We're in love with him, and we have fallen for him, and we can see how multidimensional he is, how he is not just one thing, and how interesting he is too. And we also understand from the outset that he's been through a lot already. So this is so fascinating to me that the process started in a certain place for you and ended in another place. And what you end up with is just a fully formed family, a fully formed character. Because it is more than just about addiction. There's this idea about grief, about grieving losses. There's this idea about shame in terms of this novel, but then also about very specific brands of forgiveness that I see, that, and I'll say that with no spoilers at all, but just there is this beautiful idea. And that again is not to say that, everything has such a tidy ending, because it doesn't and it never will. And that's not the way that life works. But this is not just about an addiction in a family just destroying everybody, the end. That is just not what this is about.
Yeah, I had a close childhood friend, and we were friends from very young, and his father struggled with a drug addiction. And there's actually a piece of paper that we still have that he had written in like third grade in careful cursive letters, where he wrote that his greatest fear was to become an addict. And very tragically, in his story, he did, and that is how he ended up passing away in his early 20s, leaving behind a young daughter. And so I think that's part of what was in my heart as I started writing my Ryan, and I named Ryan Bright after my friend Ryan. So that's where I got his name. And I just thought, what would it have looked like if he had lived longer and had this, it doesn't, you don't excuse the behavior, you don't, it doesn't just magically go away, but what would it look like to have a longer life with a family? And so I appreciate what you're saying in that the book opens with Ryan as a child. And I think that's really important to remember the whole arc of somebody's life. And there's even a part in the book where Lillian's she has this moment where she's almost hit over the head with this, like she feels like she's kind of thinking of him as a baby, a child, a teenager, an adult, an old man, even in the future. And just it gives so much grace to that person in the moment. And again, I can't emphasize enough that there's still certainly a place in a discussion for healthy boundaries and for not just, forgiveness does not mean that you're saying what the person did is okay. It means you're saying it's not okay, but we're going to figure out how to move forward. And I think that's what happened several times in the book. And so, yeah, I was saying Lillian just she's hit over the head with seeing Ryan almost outside of time and just thinking he's been up against a lot. He had his own difficult childhood. He's trying to do better over and over. He is making attempts and he is sorry for when he fails. He knows that he's not living the way he might want to live. And that's a different story than it might be. It's just his one story, and not everyone is like that. But in this case, that is what they go through. And so I think, yes, that ability to remember to just kind of see each other and these characters seeing each other, and not always, you can't do that all the time, but in a moment of grace where you can see you're a whole person with a whole life, and here we are in just one moment of that whole life.
I do want to mention Georgette, Jet, and ask you this question, maybe with her in mind. What do you want readers to understand about the ways we inherit deep family problems and then can navigate our lives and somehow survive as best we can? Maybe it goes to this idea of Jet's story, what she represents to you.
That's a great question. I love talking about Georgette. She's in the very center of this novel, and really through her, we're trying to make sense of the Bright family. And I had a lot of fun writing her. She's just, whether it's internal or external, she's kind of unafraid to just be raw, but to also say it or think it like it is. As she's processing, she certainly goes through times where she's unsure how to move forward in life because she's been hurt by her family. She becomes a photographer. So there's a lot of art in this book, and the importance of art and how it can be healing and how beauty is important in our lives. Ryan is an artist, and he starts an art gallery, and then Georgette becomes a photographer, which I didn't do this on purpose, but it really ended up being an interesting way for her to be capturing and observing life kind of from the outside of other people, because photographers get asked to photograph weddings and even births, and there she's asked to observe these life events kind of from the outside, and it just gives her another chance to think about, what has my life been? What do I want it to be? Specifically, is she willing to open herself up to love, to romance, when she has seen, she's going in with eyes open. Not everybody does, but she has seen, watched up close and personal, her parents really struggle off and on for years. And so not everybody goes into adulthood with these open eyes like this, but she really does. And so that she has more fear about moving forward and opening herself up to love, and she has to make those decisions. And I think in the Bright family, a lot of their griefs and their losses and the secrets that are held back, we get those a little earlier in their story, earlier in their lives and in the book. And then so much of the book is an exploration of, what do we do with that now? What happens in the aftermath of struggle, and how do we move forward in a way that is brave and a willing. It's a very brave thing to love people, and especially when you've been hurt by someone, or when we're talking about these generational things. Georgette also has a fear of hurting others. She doesn't want to be hurt or hurt others. And so, yeah, she really has to reconcile with her past and her parents' past, and then has this kind of season, this opportunity where she's almost just watching the world happen around her and really considering, can I be brave enough to love, even though I've seen sometimes what the cost of it can be? Is it worth it?
Sarah, I've had so much fun hearing about all the buzz about your novel and totally understanding why there's so much buzz around your book. Sarah Damoff, The Bright Years. Thank you so much for talking to me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sarah Damoff is the author of The Bright Years. It's published by Simon & Schuster. Sarah Damoff is also a social worker who lives in Texas with her husband and children. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.